Welcome to the Family Office Sherpa podcast. I'm your host, Shaun Parkin, founder and managing director of Whole Road Investments. The aim of this podcast is to provide practical and implementable advice for those looking to build, manage, or service a family office. This is not, however, investment advice, so please check the disclaimer in the show notes. In this episode, we are digging into the family office endowment model.
This is the Family Office Sherpa.
So what is the endowment model and how does it relate to family offices? Well, as the name suggests, the endowment model was developed by large institutions, endowments, such as university endowments. Those usually cited are US universities as they are the most well-known, such as Harvard and Yale. David Swenson is known to most as the originator of this model, to the point where it's referred to as the Yale model, as he was the CEO of that endowment back in the day. For some, the endowment model is one that aims to preserve the purchasing power of the fund while supporting its ongoing financial needs. So you can understand why it's quite attractive to family offices who have that similar mindset. My clients when I was at State Street were the three large endowments in Australia, namely University of New South Wales, University of Sydney, and the Australian National University out of Canberra. And when I established Whole Road, I noticed that family offices were seeking to build their portfolios in a similar way. Well, at least they said they were. So that's why I think it's quite a worthwhile exercise to dig into the way that these are managed. So why do family offices look favourably at this model? As mentioned, it's long-term and patient capital is what you'd probably call the family office superpower in that it has a time horizon which is not dictated by anyone but themselves. So it can be really, really long-term. So that more endowment style model can be very attractive. It allows for intergenerational buy-in. You know, if we're talking about assets that are going to be passed on that are not just about what can we do with them now, but we're looking into the future, like I said, a university endowment, it creates a real buy-in for intergenerational wealth transfer. It also includes distributions as well as capital growth as major goals. So as I mentioned, it's long-term, but you are looking at distributions or similar to a bursary as well as capital growth. So it's not eating into that corpus. So it's not eating into that from an inflation perspective. So like family offices, which is we like to retain the assets, we're looking to protect from the downside, but we're also looking to make distributions from the assets as well, which is, again, very similar to family offices. And at its core, it's a true multi-asset portfolio compared to, say, a 60-40 style equities fixed income portfolio or balanced portfolio. So it is, again, a little bit more attractive to family offices that like alternative assets. So for family offices that use as a template for the office, let's go through what I have seen in terms of the setup of the structure. A lot of the time they set it up as a separate fund for this style of investments. They might call it a future fund or the endowment or something like that. Basically, it's sometimes carved out as a separate portfolio from maybe the sub-portfolios and things like that. But a lot of the time it's carved out as a separate for this style of investment, really heavily involved in core and satellite. So they carve out a core of highly efficient markets, those sort of highly efficient like public equities and things like that. And they spend their fee budget on the more inefficient satellite investments, similar to sort of an endowment. They take on high allocations to a wider range of alternative asset classes. We're talking hedge funds, things like long, short, global, macro, things like that. Private credit, really quite idiosyncratic assets, and also more niche portfolio constituents, which are really interesting to family offices as well, such as direct investments, so we're going into direct companies, but also things as interesting as water rights or something similar. So what have I seen some of the reasons why family offices cite when utilising this method? So why are they, what's the examples they're giving? It can be low turnover. So it's not priced every day. We're not looking to rebalance all the time because the types of assets tend to be alternatives and illiquid assets. So that low turnover of the portfolio means that there's potentially less noise associated with it. The psychology of patient capital means that less inclined to chase performance and also less inclined to be forced or in, looking to sell at the wrong time. So because you can't sell a lot of the assets, because like I mentioned, they tend to be quite illiquid, or they tend to be those assets that might have lockup periods and things like that. So for a family that is looking to have that steady investment time horizon, it's sometimes really good not to be able to change it. They also talk about how it takes advantage of inefficiencies that require time to play out. Like I said, that patient capital is a superpower. So they can take advantage of those investments that might have long-term investment horizons, because that's the way that it's beneficial for the portfolio. The other one is sort of diversification, which is a central tenet of this model. And exposure to uncorrelated asset classes can really smooth out returns over long periods. So almost, a lot of them cite the fact that there's less potential for volatility, less red at the wrong time sort of thing. Often, it does align, or it's an implementable version of their investment policy. Like I said, I work with families on writing and establishing investment policy and strategy. And a lot of the time, the language used, which is intergenerational, which is long-term, and all these sorts of things, really lend themselves to an endowment style model, which is, like I said, that patient capital. Now, what are some things to consider when you are sort of looking at this as a model? And again, we're not being too precious here. We're not saying this is the only way that you can do it. This is the model. You have to manage the assets in a particular way. There's good research and things like that around sort of the ideal model. But again, it does come back to the family and the family office and the way that they would like to manage the assets. But these are things to consider when you look at sort of more endowment, long-term, illiquid assets. Private markets can have different cycles under different, they have performance under different parts of the cycle than, say, public markets. So some recent examples of how that sort of manifests itself, or how it plays out. If you look at the recent sort of Australian Super, which is a big pension fund in Australia, there has been some publicity around sort of their private equity book and how that's performing. There has been recent underperformance of some of the larger schools in the United States. If you look at the benchmarking that occurs there between those with this more endowment Yale model versus those with liquid investments. Those with liquid investments have done potentially better. And that's just part of that you have to deal with the fact that it might perform differently during different parts of the cycle and things like that. Another one is there's added complexity for reporting and data management. Public markets are relatively easy to report on because they're listed, the pricing is daily and things like that. And the data comes from exchanges. It's relatively straightforward in terms of capture, whereas private market investments and those harder to manage because they're inefficient. They're not always priced. They're not always getting that information. So managing that complexity and also the analytics associated with that complexity can be a challenge for family offices that might potentially be more used to getting much higher clarity on public market type investments. There is often, because of those types of assets that this model tends to lean into, there is a higher fee structure, and therefore you really do have to have skill sets in picking those managers that outperform on a net of fee basis, which can be a challenge. There's like I mentioned, there's a high dispersion between top tier managers in private markets. So the difference between the best performing and potentially the second, third tier it can be extremely large. And there's some really good research out there and feedback around sort of how difficult it is to manage to pick these or select these top performing managers if you don't have the scale or you don't have the history of selecting them. The other thing to consider too for families that are looking at this model is the inability to exit potentially underperforming assets, because they tend to be locked up for certain periods of time. They are illiquid, which is what you're looking to get compensated for. And so that lack of exit can be a challenge, something to be considered. I'm not sure if it's a challenge or not for everyone that can be okay with that illiquidity, but it's something to consider. And also due to the type of investments, like I said, you need to have a real skill set to manage that portfolio construction piece, to be able to outsource to good partners or to do it yourself, build portfolios. So it's a real insource piece there. there's very little day-to-day transparency, very, very little day-to-day price discovery. So, you are sort of beholden to longer cycles within that. And it is tempting to change cycle when there is underperformance. You probably saw that recently with the outperformance of public markets versus private markets. It is tempting to say, well, this isn't working, or we need to go back to a different model. So, that being true to label or true to your style can be something to consider as well. And there needs to be scale. So if you talk about the endowment model and why it was set up by large institutions like the Yale University Endowment, is because they had scale. They had the ability to write these tickets of certain size, and also to be able to allocate a certain amount to private market fund managers or direct, going in there directly. So you either have to have the scale or you have to have access to that scale for it to be effective a lot of the time. The other thing to consider is performance and benchmarks. So let's talk about how people benchmark and performance around this model. There's a concentration for portfolio managers within this space is, compensation for illiquidity needs to be factored into your benchmarks. Some examples I've seen as an example, private equity is, say, public markets plus a percentage. So if you've got a fund manager and private side that is US-centric private equity, then maybe something like US small caps plus a percentage, say 4% or something like that. I mean, it's up to you to decide how you're compensated for that illiquidity, but there is an element of public markets plus the compensation rate. A lot of the time, family offices utilize a CPI plus target as outperforming inflation is a big part of that goal. The long-term horizon, so you need to be comfortable with higher tracking error within these portfolios against public markets. And that does represent some challenges when, like I said, when public markets are running hot, is the fact that you are potentially going to have some periods of underperformance. So you need to benchmark appropriately, but you also need to give it the right amount of time to smooth out that cycle. So that sometimes you see in investment policies and things like that, which tends to be around sort of the maybe 7 to 10 year period. So to sum up, so what else have I seen? There is an increased use of impact within these models, so impact investing, which is quite attractive to some family offices. There's an ability to go into other more niche investments within this structure because, you are looking at that long-term asset management, so things like deep tech and things like that, which can be attractive but maybe don't lend itself to a more shorter-term model. There is also a movement, or there's a use case for the outsourced chief investment officer structure here to build, like I said, if you don't have the scale, you need access to the scale. And that OCIO structure does kind of lend itself to that, ability to tap into scale of larger businesses. So that seems to be something that we're starting to see as well. There's also a use case for institutional asset consultants or investment consultants that might be a little bit more aligned to institutions rather than, and family offices are to a certain degree institutions, asset owners, but we're starting to see some family offices and larger foundations move or utilize those institutional consultants because they've probably got more experience in this space than more retail-focused asset consultants. And finally, we are starting to see the wealth managers start to use this term. There's a want to not look after just the one sleeve of the family office portfolio, but more to have a total overview. And it's not necessarily that they want to manage all the assets within that overview. Like the purview might include external parties, but that endowment model means that you need to understand all the componentry within there for that particular portfolio. So therefore, we are starting to see wealth managers go, look, we will be an advocate almost for you, and we will build this portfolio, but we will utilize our research and our investment skill set to be more, I hate to say it, but holistic as a term. So that's what I'm saying. Thanks for listening. Hopefully it was of interest. If you want to find me on LinkedIn, it's just Shaun Parkin at LinkedIn. If you're looking for more family office information or insights, if I can call it that, subscribe to the Family Office Sherpa newsletter at wholeroad.com.au. If you're a family office or you're an advisor of a family office and you're interested in learning more about how I particularly assist on the investment governance and strategy, feel free to email me, Shaun, so SHAUN at hallroad, HALLROAD.com.au. So until next time, thanks for listening.